And when we're gone, others move on. No time for rest will ever come, as everyone is looking for a way. Loudly blared through headphones into James's ears, as he jogged through the icy air, carrying a heavy box in both arms. He was zoning out for the most part, just getting lost in the rhythm of the music and his steps, although every now and then he had to watch out slightly whenever one of the dogs frolicking all around him came a bit too close and threatened to trip him up, even if only on accident while trying to get his attention for a moment. James just quickly reprimanded them to be more careful with a swift whistle, and then continued as if nothing had happened. At this point, he had lost count if this was his 7th or already his 8th or 9th trip back and forth from the Dono hatch and the different storage spaces. However, his assessment that this would be a good replacement for his workout had been an accurate one. The compound was large, and some of the donated boxes were rather heavy, as they were filled with cans or densely packed food, so that his arms also had plenty of work to do as he ran back and forth to bring it all into its proper place. Well, anything that he didn't need the tractor to transport anyway, because as much strength as it granted him, even his mechanical arm would not allow him to drag around entire pallets of donated goods. People were really being generous while he was gone, it seemed. And while he ran and distributed everything around the compound to the places where it was supposed to be, he also made a point of picking up every stray, leftover decorations that he could find, stuffing them in a backpack he had put on for that very purpose. All the while, the ode to strange suns kept blasting into his ears. To reach the stars and see what's past, with all of us, space ain't so fast, and there will always be another day. Additionally to his earphones that were serenading him there, he had really packed himself up today. Hat, scarf, gloves, the whole shebang. He had even put on a face mask just to be sure, not because he was cold of course, but because as much as he had tried to diminish his uncle's fears earlier, being recognised in a video or live on stream really didn't sound like too good of a time to him. Therefore he went with the most plausible disguise he could think of at the time, someone who just couldn't handle the cold. The time had flown by as he did his clean-up thing, and honestly, had you asked him at the time, he wouldn't have been able to tell you how long he had been at it already, when the flow of music into his ears was suddenly interrupted by an intrusive jingle, pushing itself into the forefront. And of course right at his favourite part as well. Thrown off his rhythm by the sudden intrusion, James slowed his steps for a moment while his brain caught up with what had just happened. However, after only a brief moment his hand shot up to his ear, pressing a button on the headphones to accept the incoming call. "Hello," he greeted unprofessionally. Due to his vacation, he didn't entirely care if some form of bigwig was trying to reach him and expected a formal greeting. Even if it was one of his bosses, they could live with a casual greeting at the very least, until they had introduced themselves. "You reached Aldwyn." However, as ready as he was for some possibly indignant reply from some high officer of the military, or maybe even some political representative, the voice that did greet him was a lot more familiar, and admittedly a lot more immediately concerning than that, and James stopped right in his tracks as a familiar, vague female tone replied. "Hello, Ambassador Aldwyn. It has been a while. I hope your journey to Earth was a comfortable one." Avesalon was speaking perfect English now. Great. It shouldn't have surprised James how quickly a realized sapient would have picked up an entirely new language, but it certainly wasn't reassuring to him, either. "The party you announced to us has arrived in the meantime," Avesalon continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that James was taking a moment to adjust to them, calling him so unexpectedly. "As per your request, they were cautiously welcomed to the Net territories, and will be granted courteous diplomatic contacts, while also assuring that they cannot cause any further damages while under our care." James let out a hesitant breath. While he was no longer actively terrified of the artificial being, such a casual conversation still wasn't exactly something he was all too comfortable with, which admittedly threw his earlier thoughts right back into his face. "Thank you, Avesalon," James replied, suddenly switching back to a more professionally acceptable tone. "I hope everything else is going well on your end." In the meantime, he picked his pace back up, figuring he could at least walk while talking. After all, the place wasn't cleaning itself up. "Negotiations with Quafrem are a drag, as I'm sure you're aware, but they are moving forward even if slowly," Avesalon informed him, her voice not quite representing the drawn-out emotions that James would expect in such a sentence. However, Her tone did slightly lighten up as she mentioned, "On the other hand, Sophia's studies have been going incredibly well. I've never seen her so eager. With just a little bit of fostering, I'm sure she'll grow up to be an absolute ace." James exhaled slowly, a slight smile forming on his face despite his discomfort, as a big cloud of steam escaped his lungs into the cold winter air. "I'll pass it on," he replied, knowing well that Sheeda would be delighted to hear those news. He had no idea what her exact plans with that girl were, but he knew she had at least taken a liking to her, and hearing that she was doing well was a good thing regardless. For a moment, his eyes glided along the glistening, snow-covered surroundings of the compound, to the animals walking around in their enclosures, and to the house poking out above it all in the distance. He remembered Sheeda's comment about it all, and for a moment he felt some weakness overcome him, before he quickly shook it off again. Maybe he should actually take part in this conversation, instead of just reacting to what he was being told. What about those soldiers that tried to arrest us? I hope Quafrem heeded my warning. If a Veselon would ever sigh, James was sure this would have been the moment, based on her tone alone, as she answered, "Well, he didn't have to. It seems they left our territories, together with some others. I don't have eyes on the outside, so I don't know where they went. But apparently, they didn't want to stick around and figure out what the consequences would be when someone would inevitably try to push the blame for what happened onto them." She paused for a moment, as if contemplating something. If it was a hard enough question to make an AI pause, it was probably a big one. Ultimately, she seemingly decided to tell him. "However, there are rumours floating around that they were also working with another diplomatic faction, part of which was also human. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" James stopped in place again. More diplomats? And human ones? What could that mean? And why wasn't he already informed of this? "Absolutely no idea," he replied honestly, and physically shook his head, even though a Veselon obviously couldn't see him. Hopefully. "But it does sound concerning. Though if the higher-ups know, I'm sure they're already feverishly looking into it." He had no idea if she believed him or not. However, she at the very least didn't try to call him out for any perceived lies. "I'm sure they are," she just replied, almost resigned. She did become a bit friendlier again when she asked, "That is all I wanted to talk about. I wish you a relaxing rest of your vacation, Ambassador. May I pass on anything to Zisidi or Zephyr?" James pondered that for a second. "You can thank Zisidi for picking up my slack while I'm relaxing," he then said, while beginning to walk again. "And if she keeps up her studies, I'm sure Sheeda will want to send something over for Sapphire in the near future. Call it a hunch." "Very well," Veselon replied. "Rest well, Ambassador." With a click, the conversation was over, and got quickly replaced by the renewing blasting of lyrics and music into his ears, which caused him to quickly pull the headphones off. Maybe he would go without music for a bit. By now, he had reached one of the storage sleds that littered the place in between enclosures and walkways, and he quickly opened it to bring the package he was carrying inside, keeping the dogs out with a quick whistle, while he closed it behind him again. Swiftly, he ripped the package open and began stacking the cans of preserved meats onto the shelves neatly, the monotonous work leaving his brain with way too much free time to think. The soldiers had fled the territories together with humans there on a diplomatic mission, which he knew nothing about? Why didn't he know nothing about that? There was no way that neither humanity, nor either of the leading Comauto panel of Dunamur, had knowledge about that party. After all, if they were there for diplomacy, they had to have had some form of diplomatic contact with someone, right? Had he just not been informed? Well, maybe. After all, it wasn't exactly his job to worry about that kind of thing. The job of an ambassador wasn't exactly to fight other ambassadors for attention, or to try and figure out what their deal was. That's what intelligence services were for, and he probably hadn't been on Reason's mail list for a while now. There were likely plenty of people out there already working away at finding out who these people were, what they were about, and where exactly they had run off to. And they likely didn't exactly need him for that. In fact, much like he kept things like a Veselon a secret from most other agents of humanity, they were likely withholding sensitive information from him as well, especially while he wasn't on duty. It wasn't his place to worry about all this, but, well, tell that to his overthinking mind. As he placed the last can on the shelf, he paused, keeping it in his hand as he pressed it down onto the one underneath it. his body temporarily catching itself in a stupor, while his mind did somersaults. Come on, he thought to himself. Just relax, damn it. Finally letting go of the can, which to his shame was now slightly dented from the tight grip of his mechanical hand, he exhaled, trying to release some tension. He had to admit it to himself. He needed a distraction. At least that was his thought process, as he reached into his pocket and rummaged for his phone. And this is the very uncreatively named Packer, James said, and used his phone's camera to zoom onto a quite impressive male lion, who was lying underneath a heat lamp on the other side of the enclosure. Even from this far away, the lion's ears twitched at the mention of his name, and he lifted his maned head to look over at who exactly was disturbing his peace by talking about him behind his back there. James knew well what would happen next. Him and Packer had a routine, and the amber eyes of the lion already showed him that the big cat wasn't going to let him down today. I actually helped raise him from a small cub, after he was sold by poachers. As you can see, he's missing a leg, so releasing him wasn't an option. However, that doesn't mean he's harmless by any means. As he spoke, Packer was already pushing himself up, and began to slowly trudge through the snow and in James's direction, openly prancing at first, before slowing down and bending his legs a bit more, as the yellow beast tried to hide away his massive frame behind the highly piled snow. You know, there are people out there that will swear to you up and down that you can tame any animal, you just have to raise them right from a young age. They will tell you, wild animals, if bottle-raised, will be just as tame as any domesticated pet. He continued his explanation and pretended like he didn't even notice the predator, as Packer gradually crept closer, only slightly slowed down in his sneaking approach by the fact that he had only one front leg. In fact, instead of acknowledging as much, James began to gradually turn away from the enclosure, bringing the phone's view around as well, switching it to the front-facing camera so he could look at the phone while filming himself. Unknown to only him and the lion, there was a very clear signal. But let me tell you from experience. Almost as soon as he had turned around completely, he could hear the crunching of snow behind him. The crystals were compressed by a large weight pushing down onto them, as Packer jumped out of his hiding spot and pounced towards the back of the unsuspecting ape standing in front of his cage. James, of course, didn't see it, but he heard and almost felt the impact, as the lion threw his weight against the fence behind him, the metal clinking, as it slightly flexed under the predator's weight and strength, but otherwise holding tight. As he stood up to his full height, and pushed the claws of his remaining paw through the mesh, Packer let out a threatening and, at this distance, almost deafening roar, most likely while prettily presenting his pearly whites for the world to see. Having done this so often, James didn't even flinch at the lion's attack anymore, although a certain pit in your stomach always remained when such a powerful being was roaring at you. Still, he just calmly finished his sentence. Raising them by hand doesn't mean shit. From the other side of the line, a worried inhale could be heard, and he saw Moore momentarily cover her long face with her hands while the attack unfolded. However, after she heard no screams of agony, and also noticed how calm James was being, her dark eyes peeked out from behind her claws again, only to see James smile widely at her. "Really, James, my poor heart," the old woman slightly scolded him, one of her hands indeed lowering to her chest, as if to feel her own heart beating. Although the more she calmed down, the more she could apparently appreciate the showmanship he was putting on here. "Is that animal trained to do that when you give their speech specifically?" James glanced back at the lion, who was still threateningly growling at him, although now that he had been spotted, Packer dropped back down to all three again. "What, he?" James asked, and nodded in the animal's direction. "Nah, he just hates me. I was being serious when I said that raising them doesn't mean too much. You can never be sure how tame a wild animal will turn out in the end, and it's even worse with domesticables, because they can flip on a dime." Casually, he now began to wander past the lion's enclosure because, while glancing around, he had spotted another decorative tree that was half buried in the deep snow. Kneeling down, he took off his backpack and opened it to stuff the plastic plant replica inside of it. "We're doing our best to educate the public on why it's just not a good idea to keep some animals as pets. Packer is a very handy example most of the time," he explained, while he stored the decoration away. "But sadly, that's but a drop on a hot stone, as we say around here. Even if we were able to reach all people, I doubt everyone would be willing to listen. Moore seemed to slightly shudder as he explained. Well, you have convinced me. On the other hand, I cannot imagine inviting something like that into my home willfully. I don't understand why people would want that, especially if they know that it is dangerous. The old lady explained, while combing through the long hair around her neck with her claws. James sighed. Well, they are majestic, they are imposing, they are beautiful. People love and admire these animals, and they wish to be as close as possible to them because of that. He made his own best guess at why humans behaved like they did when it came to dangerous animals. After all, that was why he loved being around them. But he also knew what he was doing. For many years, people feared them and hunted them nearly to extinction. And now that those times are over and we know more about them, they have suddenly swung in the exact opposite direction and want to have them around and coddle them. Both aren't exactly ideal. There is a delicate balance there between driving them out and keeping them too close, and it is important to strike that if we want to coexist with them. It is difficult, but it should be possible, assuming people are willing to listen. Moore reached up, loudly clacking one of her claws along the notches of one of her horns. A noble cause, she admitted, while James stood up again and began walking towards his next destination. He was glad that he had the old lady there to keep him company, and keep his mind occupied, even if only via video chat. By now, even the dogs had abandoned him, and the fact that they weren't constantly running around him anymore was a clue that indicated that the people Flynn would be leading around the place today had arrived. They were very well trained, and keeping visitors in check while they were on the premises was one of their main tasks, one which they fulfilled with a lot of enthusiasm. Originally, he had also tried to reach Curie to get them in on the call, but whatever was going on with them and Nadiro was apparently also keeping them occupied today. He just wished he could help them out with that somehow, but he didn't even know what was going on with them. And in the wild, these animals are not causing any problems for humans? Moore suddenly asked, thankfully pulling James out of his own head before he could worry too much. Wiping some stray hair that stuck out from under his hat away from his face, James chuckled. Not usually, no. They tend to stay away from cities and humans, and they tolerate us when we enter their territories for the most part, he explained, while zeroing in on another forgotten piece of decoration, a wreath hanging off of one of the fences this time. Honestly, they are almost making more of an effort for a peaceful coexistence than we are, with a few rare exceptions. Moore nodded understandingly, while James pitched the wreath off the fence. In all honesty, I am impressed to what level humans seem to exist in harmony with nature, given anything I learned about them so far. As well as the hyper-competitive evolution of your planet, I expected much differently, she mused, with a well-meaning smile. However, James had to pull himself together to not laugh aloud at her statement. I wouldn't call the relation harmonious exactly, he mumbled instead, and thought about the best way to explain and justify some of the crazier things his people had done over the years, when his attention was suddenly pulled away towards some very noticeable movement on his left. In his periphery, it just looked like an orange and a lime-green dot floating around in mid-air. However, when he turned his head, he saw that it was indeed two people with very gaudily hair colours wandering around the place, together with Flynn leading the way for them, although his uncle with his pale skin and grey clothes had basically blended in with the background, when James hadn't been looking directly at them. The people he was leading around there seemed young. One of them was going in the direction of extreme femininity with their appearance, wearing clothes that, despite their thickness, clung tightly to their hourglass of a body, while their lime-green hair hung all the way down to their back. That one also seemed to be the centre of attention, because they were prancing around with animated movements and speaking in a loud, high-energy manner, while the other one stood back and held the camera, capturing their companions' theatrics. The camera person had a more laid-back appearance, wearing simple black winter clothes and having cut their orange hair back to a manageably short haircut. Those had to be Sassentrix and Alfador then, James guessed. They certainly looked the part of a modern influencer to him. If you wanted to get attention in that business, you also had to look attention-grabbing. If it wasn't the deepest winter, he was sure they would express that in their clothing a lot more as well. Maybe it was a bit premature, but given the endings of their names, James automatically assumed the hyper-feminine one to be Sassentrix, and the more restrained one to be Alfador, although he probably wasn't going to go over there to ask. The colourful group was of course trailed by the large pack of big dogs, although Flynn held the animals at a good distance with some simple commands, while he showed his guests around. James paused as he watched them, a nostalgic expression creeping over his face. Flynn looked so alive, especially when compared with the tired way his uncle had dragged himself around so far ever since they arrived. He now seemed like a completely different person. He had a big smile on his face and was moving energetically, the cold air carrying his voice far and wide, as he loudly talked about the compound and their different animals, as well as all the stuff that went into taking care of them. Soon, he began a very similar explanation to what James had told Moore earlier, about how people for some reason thought taming wild animals was exceptionally easy and safe, and as he did so, he briefly indicated towards his disguised nephew, who still had a very disgruntled male lion hot on his trail as he walked along the enclosure. Of course, the orange-haired camera person quickly brought the lens around to film the concealed person, who strolled along casually, while an angry lion was roaring at him. Briefly, James lifted his hand to wave back at him, while Flynn explained that he had helped with the bottle racing of that specific lion, but then he turned away again, not wanting to get too caught up in the interaction if he could. Instead, he excused himself to Moore about the distraction, and then took off in the other direction to also explain some more things to her, just to kill the time a bit. He decided to cut the old lady a bit of a break, and thus manoeuvred himself over to where some of their generally more harmless, and more importantly herbivorous guests were housed. Of course, nothing here was truly harmless, but the risk while interacting was much lower with things like abandoned kangaroos and capybaras than it was with tigers and angry lions. With an apple in hand, these friendlier examples of Earth life were fully content to sit around with him for a bit and nibble on what he offered while he crouched in the barn that was keeping them from getting too cold in the winter. Believe it or not, this old guy here is responsible for more of my scars than most of the big cats combined, he explained, while scratching along the back of one of the giant red kangaroos that was currently eagerly eating one of the fruits out of his hand. Those claws aren't to be messed with, and he has no idea how strong he actually is, so when he comes at you, you're not leaving without bleeding. Demonstratively, he pulled the sleeve covering his organic arm back a bit to point out some of the deepest scratches that were long since healed. Of course, none of them compared to the 5 impressive beauty marks Sheeda had left on him, but they were much more numerous in their numbers. You can somewhat teach a predator not to bite or scratch, but you absolutely cannot teach a roo not to grab you, he added with a chuckle. I wonder what Pippa would think of that, Moore mused, while observing the peacefully eating animal that apparently was much more dangerous than it seemed. They do look astoundingly similar. Earth seems to have a clone for everything out in the cosmos. James blinked slowly. Now there was a name he hadn't heard in a while. Pippa. He really hoped she was okay. He hadn't heard anything from her ever since the GCS. He had half hoped to run into her when they went back to the GES to get their stuff, but no such luck. He really wondered how she was doing. Well, not for everything, but we have a lot of room and a lot of diverse evolutionary paths. If it is a successful model, it probably evolved on Earth in some form at some point, James mused, trying to shoo away the worrisome thoughts. It comes with evolution competitive enough that every niche needs to be filled. Is there a look-alike for Raphaelite as well? Moore asked curiously, and leaned in a bit closer to her own device, cutting off parts of her large face on the feed, while her eye got a lot bigger in the picture. James raised an eyebrow. She had lived among humans for a while now, surely she knew at this point. Still, he replied with a shrug. They used to be, but they went extinct ages ago. Probably because of us. That happened a lot throughout history. Lots of things suddenly disappeared once our ancestors hit the scene. Oh, Moore replied, with slight hesitation in her voice. How unfortunate. James took a deep breath and leaned back a bit, as he looked to the animals currently eating out of his hand. We're doing our best not to let it happen again. Moore was also quiet for a moment, and as the room fell into silence, except for the munching and scurrying of animals, there was suddenly a vague background noise James started to pick up on. Soon, Moore wanted to speak up again. However, James indicated for her to please remain quiet for a moment longer, while he tried to make out what the noise was. It was far away, but he felt like he heard barking, but not excited barking, alarm barking, and were those shouts? That didn't sound good at all. "I have to check something quickly," James announced and sprang up, scaring the capybaras away and causing the kangaroos to stomp at him indignantly. However, he couldn't care much for that as he hurried out of the barn and into the open. Now back in the cold winter air, he could hear the noise a lot better. There were definitely people shouting somewhere, and the dogs sounded angry. Very angry. Usually they only got like that when someone was trying to climb over the fences. "Is everything alright, James?" Moore's voice now came through the line, as she apparently couldn't bear staying quiet anymore. "I hope so," James mumbled, as he started in the direction of the noise. At first he was walking, but it quickly turned more and more into a run with each step, as the barking and shouting just wouldn't let up. He tried to make out individual voices or words, but it was all just white noise from this distance. However, it sounded like there were a lot of people there. Far more than he would expect around here. Basically flying through the compound, and causing multiple animals to run along with him as he dashed by their enclosures, James got closer and closer to the noise. Rounding another corner, he saw the scene in front of him. He was standing inside the inner fence of the compound. A crowd of seemingly agitated people had congregated outside of the outer fence of the perimeter, and in between, the dogs ran around, patrolling left to right and warningly barking and snarling at the people outside, daring them to try and cross this barrier into the canine's territory. Standing in the middle of the riled-up dogs were the two colourful guests that Flynn had led around earlier, although James's uncle himself was absent, most likely making a phone call to the police if James had to guess by the image alone. The two influencers on a tour of the facility had their camera directed at the crowd of shouting people that were aggressively gesturing at the fence and waving around clearly homemade signs of some kind, as if this was a formal protest. "Monster lover," some of them read, "bootlicker," some others, or "never another Michael." And by the sounds of it, it was all captured live on stream. "Suddenly appeared and started shouting and throwing things at Mr. Krieger," he could hear the lime-green hair one say, only catching the tail end of their report to their viewers. "I don't know what's going on here, but surely there has to be a better way to achieve it than this." Their orange companion dutifully kept the camera on the irate crowd, trying to capture the whole ordeal with a panning shot. "Shut it, bootlicker!" one of the people in the crowd cried back at them, and started to push forward to the first line of the protesters. Speaking for the first time that James had noticed, the orange-haired one now scoffed and replied, "Bootlicker? This is an animal sanctuary. What kind of boot is there to lick?" The protesting party didn't like that very much, and some of them burst forwards towards the fence, although a more than toothy greeting from the dogs on the other side made them quickly back off again. Still not satisfied with that, one of the protesters, an older, rough-looking gentleman, leaned down and picked something up from the frozen ground, shouting, "Like you don't know! You're harboring a criminal in there!" as he held it towards the camera person with surprising accuracy. The golf ball-sized stone made its way through the wide mesh of the fence and flew with dangerous speed right at the face of the younger person, who flinched as they barely had time to react to it, since they had been focusing on their camera work. Vainly, they lifted their arms up to protect their face, and cringed as they braced for impact. However, before it came to that, the stone stopped in midair, having been caught in a dark, mechanical hand that now held onto it tightly. Being one of the only people allowed to do so, James had hopped the inner fence without the dogs interfering, and quickly burst forward to stop the projectile in its tracks. The orange-haired one stared at him wide-eyed for a moment, as they apparently processed what had just occurred. Thanks, they mumbled, and tried to find James's eyes in his almost completely covered face. "Turn the camera off and step away from the fence," James instructed firmly, and dropped the rock while moving in between the kid and the crowd. "What?" they mumbled, but James didn't even let them finish before repeating himself. "Turn the damn camera off and get away from the fence." Next to him, there was some green movement as the other influencer stepped over to him. "Hey, I don't know who you think you are, but you can't tell us what..." They irately started to berate him. However, they were cut short when James noticed another projectile coming straight for them just in time, batting it away with his mechanical hand, breaking it in the process, and causing splinters and shrapnel to fly everywhere. Freaking civilians. Zero survival instinct to be found. James was just about to open his mouth and tell them he would just throw them out if they didn't do what he said immediately, when suddenly there was murmuring in the crowd. "That's him, isn't it? Did you see that strike? It has to be." What are the chances of 2 huge cyborg guys running around the place? James ground his teeth. Found out yet again. Well, at least this time he had a good reason to intervene. The influencers both looked pretty confused by the crowd's mumbling, while one of the bolder ones of the protesters stepped forth. This time, it was a slightly overweight woman with a bright blonde pixie cut. "Aldwin!" she shouted at him, her voice containing so much venom that even his own name sounded like it was used as an insult. "We know what you did on Dunamer. We know what the UHSTF is hiding. You found an AI, you traitorous bastard! A goddamn monstrosity! And you just let it be! Left it to come for all of us! Are you out of your mind? You would doom us all, and for what? To prove a point?" Supportive shouts erupted from the rest of the crowd, which was seemingly whipping itself up into a frenzy. James just stood there, frozen. How the hell did they... "Aldwin, like Ambassador Aldwin?" A high-pitched exclamation now came from his side. "Simon, make sure that you're getting all that." Apparently, Simon, the orange-haired guy, was stunned for a moment as it all unfolded. However, he heeded his colleague's call and began to raise his camera once again. However, 110% done with this nonsense, James almost immediately snatched it out of his hand, quickly finding the off switch and ending the feed. "Hey!" Simon tried to protest for a moment. However, a single harsh look from James was more than enough to immediately make him back off. Lifting his hand that still held the camera towards the inner part of the compound, James pointed a finger towards the direction of the house. "Inside, now!" he imperiously ordered, and his tone even broke down the protest of the green-haired influencer, as the shouting of the crowd also became more intense. Then he started to lead them away. "Oh, you think you can just run?" The older, ragged man shouted and dashed forwards, slamming into the fence, his fingers digging through the mesh. This immediately earned him the ire of the canines on the other side, and some of them were more than tall enough to jump up and nip at his hands with their teeth. Usually, they weren't quite so aggressive in defending the property, as long as people stayed on the outside, but that one had thrown a stone at their owner, and they weren't going to take that lying down. James stopped for a moment and stared the man down. "The police will be here any minute now," he announced, before opening up his stance and unfurling his arms in the direction of the crowd. "But until then, go ahead. Try your luck." The air zapped as lightning erupted from his fingertips, and the sound was underlined by even more barking and snarling by the dogs. Personally, James liked his odds. The old man kept on glaring hatefully, however he made not even the hint of a further move. "Coward! Bastard! Traitor!" and other, more colourful expletives were only some of the names that were shouted after James, as he led the compound's guests away from the outer fence and towards a slightly safer area, where he wouldn't have to worry about them getting themselves hurt. Suddenly, a voice came from the direction of his organic hand. "James?" Moore said hesitantly, and he flinched for a moment, since he had completely forgotten he still had her on the line. "What they just said, that—" "Sorry," he interrupted her, already apologizing beforehand. "Not right now." Moore hesitated again, this time for a long while. "I see," she then simply said. "Please, do call me back once you can." Like that, she hung up, leaving the weight of a heavy boulder that pushed right down onto his chest as she went. Damn it. Not only did she actually believe those nutcases, she was kind of right to do so. "So, you are Ambassador Aldwin." A high-pitched voice suddenly pulled him out of his glum thoughts, and his gloom was quickly replaced by annoyance, since the green-haired influencer had, after he had so firmly taken the previous device away from their partner, seemingly not taken the hint, and instead gotten out their phone, now holding another camera lens right into his face, as they tried to cut off his way by walking around him sideways. "Filming me after I specifically denied you permission is a criminal offence," James informed them, and shook his head while pushing past them with wide strides, his speed outmatching theirs easily. They swiped a strand of their long hair out of their face, as they basically ran to keep up with him. "What was that those people said about an AI?" They tried to pry further. "No comment," James replied. "Is the UHSTF hiding something you discovered on Dunamer?" "No comment." "Has anything else happened during your visit to Dunamer?" "No comment." "What is your connection to this place? How did these people know to find you here?" "I live here, but your broadcast probably helped with knowing I was around." The green-haired one step slowed gradually, and they soon came to a stop. "Oh," they mumbled, seemingly not having thought of that. Having seemingly managed to accidentally break through the thickness of their head, James also paused for a moment to look at them. "Kid, do you really think right now is the time to annoy me with those kinds of questions? I'm not an idiot. I won't barge anything out just because it's stressful. And if you don't get that camera out of my face soon, I will throw you out." Figuring that if anyone was going to make such a threat a reality, it would probably be someone like James Alwyn, the influencer relented, lowering their phone away from him resignedly. "Thanks for the help earlier." Simon then approached him with a much more diplomatic tone, lifting a hand to emphasize his thankfulness. What happens now?" James looked around. "Now I'll make sure you two are safe and can get out of here in one piece," he mumbled in reply, briefly reaching up to massage his brow with his fingers with one hand, while using the other to give Simon his camera back, hoping that he would leave it turned off now. The first bit of adrenaline was dying down now, and it left the sinking feeling of just what was ahead of him. Those people did feel like a symptom rather than a cause, and it seemed that just because he did his best to step away from it all, things weren't going to just leave him alone that easily. All he had wanted was to take a bit of a break. Well, so much for that. And then I'll have to make some unpleasant phone calls.